Oh, good.
Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give it maybe one more minute until we start, just so that the last couple people here have a chance to get into the meeting. All right, we'll go ahead and get started with some introductions. My name is Sophia Zanowski. I am the Director of Development and Registrar at St. Bernard's. It's my pleasure to be here with you all tonight. This is definitely one of the most fun parts of my job, is getting to put on events like this. I just have a couple of housekeeping items, some introductions of our co-sponsors, and then we'll get to the main event here. I do ask that Zoom etiquette, if you will, keep yourself on mute unless Sister Grace asks a question, and then you can unmute yourself to answer that. We will be running a Q&A at the end of the event, and the format that we're going to use for that is we're going to use the chat box. So throughout the event or at the end, if you have a question you'd like to ask our presenter, feel free to go ahead and put that in the chat. And Sister Grace is going to use that to kind of select which questions she will answer for the Q&A. I'm also going to monitor any technology issues. So if you run into anything weird with your Wi-Fi, feel free to put that in the chat and I'll see if I can help you out. You can also send me an email. We'll also be recording this event. So if anything does go awry, don't worry, you'll be able to watch it later. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about who we are. So like I said, I work for St. Bernard's. We are a Catholic graduate school located in upstate New York with campuses in Rochester and Albany. And then we also serve students from across the state and across the country and the world through our distance education program. We have a couple of master's degrees in theology and philosophy. We also have some certificate programs where you can take a cluster of our courses on a niche topic without needing to commit to a full master's degree and without needing a bachelor's degree to take those classes. All of our courses are available to take from anywhere, either synchronously or asynchronously, so you can fit them into your schedule. And we just recently announced something that I want to put on all of your radars. Before I do that, let me introduce our second co-sponsor. Forgot the order of my slides there. We also partner with the Finger Lakes Guild. They are a chapter of the Catholic Medical Association that serves our diocese in Rochester. And they will put on events for us. They have a book club and they support the church, specifically Catholic hospitals and healthcare institutions, in faithfully applying Catholic moral principles in healthcare delivery. So their mission very much aligns with the theme of this presentation. So they co-sponsored this with us and helped us kind of spread the word and advertise this event to their audience and to their people. Some upcoming events and offerings. There's the slide that I had in mind. Just recently, we announced that we are opening all of our summer courses to be audited to anyone from anywhere for free, for just a small $25 technology fee. All of our summer courses are shorter. They're just 7 weeks. We have a summer session A and summer session B. So it's a little bit more manageable. The courses meet 1 time a week. So you can fit it into your schedule. And the beautiful thing about auditing is that you get to sit in on the lectures, participate in the discussions, but you don't have to do any of the assignments or write any of the papers. So my mom actually loves to audit our classes in the summer because she's a Catholic school principal. So during the year, she's very busy, but during the summer, she can sit in on the lectures, learn something for herself and not have to write any of the papers. So all of our courses are open to anyone to audit one of them for free for the summer. I'm going to put a link about this in a follow-up email I'll send probably tomorrow or Monday. So if you're interested, please take a look at that. This is only an offer for the summer. So we're hoping to welcome a wide range of auditors from all over the country and the globe into our classes. We also run a series called Words with Wine. This series tonight is called Theology and Culture. We focus on a hot topic, if you will, going on in our world. And then we also have a series that we run monthly called Words with Wine, where we focus on Catholicism and the fine arts. Our upcoming one is in 2 weeks, and our academic dean, Dr. Matthew Cooner, is going to be talking about the Pope's poetry, St. John Paul II's triptych. So I'll also put a link in my follow-up email about that upcoming event. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Sister Grace. She is a religious sister of Mercy. That order is located out of Alma, Michigan, and she holds a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Bryn Mawr College and an MD/MS from Georgetown University, where she also completed her internal medicine residency last year. During her medical training, she pursued clinical research and published in the Journal of the Endocrine Society, and also in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. She holds a certification in bioethics from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. She's currently assigned to St. Francis Xavier Home of Mercy in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and she works as a board-certified internal medicine physician in Oklahoma. We are very lucky to have her with us tonight to discuss healing, the role of religion in the pandemic. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sister Grace.
Thank you very much. Let me just get my slides up for us, okay? Can everyone see my screen okay?
Looks good on my end.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for the warm invitation. As she said, my name is Sister Grace. This is a presentation that I recently gave to a different group, so it had a little bit of a more ecumenical tone. So I've changed it just a little bit, but hopefully it'll be relevant to all of us. I have no financial disclosures. I've taken a vow of poverty. So just a little bit of an introduction. During the first half of 2020, I was functioning as a senior internal medicine resident physician on the hospital wards and in the medical intensive care unit. Concurrently, there was violent protests that had erupted nationally that were surrounding the death of a Black man during a confrontation with police. Where I lived and worked in the Washington, D.C. area, curfews were enforced to quell both mob violence and COVID-19 spread. To travel freely from my house to work, I was issued a letter that identified me as essential personnel. In the months that followed, I would occasionally pull that credentialing missive out from my glove compartment and ponder, who are essential personnel? Society assumes that physicians are essential personnel during a pandemic, but the indispensability of other groups of people involved in the healing process, such as chaplains, is less clear. When stopped by police, It was not my identity as RSM, Religious Sister of Mercy, that empowered me to get into the clinic or the hospital, but rather my MD. Yet, patients often seek me out specifically because I am a religious. The fact that the patient priority is not always aligned with society's priority should prompt us to consider what is really essential for healing. In the presentation that follows, I'm going to first provide some historical and cognitive context for the role of religion in healing. Second, I'm going to define religion and healing according to the Catholic tradition. Third, I'm going to discuss my personal experience of how religion has healed individuals. And then finally, I'm going to observe religion's role restoring or preserving the united integrity of societies. So questions are welcome during the presentation via the chat box. And depending on the question, how the flow of the presentation is going, and if it's like a question just for clarity, et cetera, I might interrupt to answer that question. Otherwise, I might wait to the end. Also, I'll pause in between each of these sections to clarify if there was any questions about that particular part of the presentation. So what has been the role of religion in medicine? Even a brief survey of the history of humanity demonstrates that religion has had a respected place in medicine in a wide variety of cultures and circumstances. The first recorded references to medicine are detailed in the cuneiform writings of the polytheistic Mesopotamians. This is their cuneiform writing pictured below. And they lived around the 5000 BC in what is present-day Syria, Iraq, and southeastern Turkey. Hundreds of these tablets were found that detail disease, diagnosis, and prescription of drugs and magical spells for treatments. Sin is considered the root to sickness, and therefore confessions are numbered among the recommended treatments. Mesopotamian healers, what they called asipu, A-S-I-P-U, which is something like an exorcist or priest, versus an asu, which is something like a medical doctor, where there are kind of different distinctions for the different types of healers. A person would sometimes play the role as an asipu and an asu simultaneously by providing both incantations and physical remedies. Ancient writings from monotheistic traditions also articulate divine themes surrounding illness. Specifically, consider, for the example, the book of Job, which some believe was composed probably around the year 500 BC, which tells the story of Job, a pious and upright Oriental chieftain who suffered sudden illness and impoverishment. Job's three friends insisted that Job's illness can only be a punishment for personal wrongdoing, and is an invitation to God, no invitation from God to repentance. Nevertheless, Job insists on his innocence, and he seeks God's explanation for suffering. God responds by observing that God's omniscience and omnipotence eclipse man's understanding and agency. Quote, "The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It changed like clay under the seal, and it dyed like a garment. Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth?" End quote. In response to God's statement, he recovers his attitude of humility and trust, is strengthened by his experience of suffering, and healed. This book is considered inspired text by both Jewish and Catholic traditions and Christian traditions. And this text positions the divine as an essential interpreter of the metaphysical reality seated in suffering and healing. Also, persons belonging to the more modern observational science tradition, such as William Harvey, also assume religion has a role in medicine. Dr. William Harvey lived between 1578 and 1657. He was a physician who made instrumental contributions in anatomy and physiology. He describes systemic circulation in detail. In a time when the discipline of human dissection was flourishing and the maxim structure reflects function had not yet developed alongside the theory of evolution, religious reflection on medical discovery occurred. Consider, for example, Harvey's opening remarks to the College of Physicians. Quote, "Since all things are to be renewed whole and entire at the time of the resurrection, the difficult question concerning the use of the bodily members is usually asked. What are we going to reply? All our members will exist there at the resurrection. We find certain members which God placed in our bodies for no specific uses, but for adornment alone." End quote. This quotation demonstrates that in the 1600s, the movers and shakers of modern medicine accepted religious speculation in their field, even during a professional gathering of physicians. It's not my purpose by giving these examples to detail the history of medicine, but rather I wanted to highlight that religion and medicine have coexisted harmoniously in a variety of cultures. Yet this harmonious coexistence of religion and medicine has not always been my experience. Working during the pandemic in a hospital as a medical resident physician, I have been approached and asked to leave the hospital because visitation is not allowed. My religious habit signaled to the healthcare workers that I, mistaken as a chaplain, was out of place on the frontiers of the pandemic. As an ASU, physician, I belonged on the wards, but as an ASAPU, religious healer, I was the third wheel. Unfortunately, even after having graduated from medical residency and now practicing independently as a board-certified internist in Muskogee, Oklahoma, I meet the occasional puzzled patient. I didn't know you could be a nun and a doctor, they say. I'm meeting many of my patients for the first time via video encounter because the patient is in quarantine with COVID-19. In a culture that questions the compatibility of religious sisterhood with medical doctorate, when I'm encountering my patients, there's often raised eyebrows that it's me addressing them during the global pandemic via video visit. Nor is my experience of implicit religious bias during the COVID-19 pandemic isolated to one occurrence or to my person alone. Consult your experience. In contemporary culture, is religion always welcome in the public sphere? Do we see religious art outside of churches or even in Catholic schools? Hospitals and stores are open in pandemic, but are churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques? Is a chaplain always called to bedside as part of the Code Blue team when death is approaching? Historians like James Hitchcock attribute the secularization of society to the Enlightenment movement that dominated Europe beginning in the 17th century. Quote, "The unfolding of history was said to demand the adaptation of doctrine to changing times. Whether or not this was done consciously, it owed much to the Darwinian evolution. Modernists tended to a radical historicalism, believing that it was impossible to transcend the limits of one's own age, and the attempts to do so were illusory. The historic creeds could not remain permanently valid, since they expressed merely the times in which they were formulated." End quote. So that's a long quote. Let's step back and digest what James Hitchcock's analysis of modernity means. Essentially, what he's asserting is that the Darwinian theory of evolution is being applied not only to explain the development of species over millions of years, but also to explain the development of religious doctrine. Such an application of the theory of evolution deserves a talk unto itself. However, it is enough to say for our purposes that if the theory of evolution is applied in such a way, it would suggest that religious doctrine taught in one generation may become outmoded and irrelevant in the next generation. just as some bodily member in a primitive organism may become obsolete in the more advanced organism. If this is the case, advanced science could be seen as the evolutionary step beyond religion, and a return to religion from science could be understood as a cognitive regression. Persons, including myself, contend that working under this cognitive framework is erroneous. Just as an ASU can work next to an ASIPU, so a physician can work next to a chaplain, or a person can be a nun and a doctor. St. John Henry Newman, one of my favorite saints, he's an Anglican convert to Catholicism. He was living between 1801 and 1890. Among other things, he was the first rector of a Catholic medical school in Dublin. He defended the notion that religion and science, including medical science, can coexist. Quote, "Granting that divine truth differs in kind from human, so do human truths differ in kind from one another. If the knowledge of the Creator is in a different order from the physical, so is physics from history, history from ethics." End quote. So one of the erroneous arguments that people use to say that religion and science is incompatible is that religion is of a different order of knowledge, or different in the way that we understand that knowledge can be understood. That being said, science is considered an absolute versus religion is considered more a relative, like that idea of evolution. So the truths of religion evolve with evolution. But if you think about that, you do a cognitive thought experiment at this moment, you realize that that is an erroneous way to think about things. So consider math, which obeys the law of contradiction. 2 + 2 = 4, and not 5. In contrast, religious truths do not necessarily follow the law of contradiction if you're following the logic of relativism within religious truths. So it could be simultaneously true that there are 20 gods in Johnny's world, while there was only one God in Jill's world 5 years ago. So this is absurd. Being, whether not divine or natural, both obey the law of contradiction. Further, if a superior being sustains the universe and serves as a principal end and good of all, it is absurd to displace God from the scene of wounded creation. Consider what John Henry Newman says is the cognitive consequence of admitting the existence of a God. Quote, "All that exists as contemplated by the human mind forms one large system or complex fact. Knowledge forms one whole because its subject matter is one. For the universe in its length and breadth is so intimately knit together that we cannot separate off portion from portion, operation from operation. Admit a God, and you introduce among the subjects of your knowledge a fact encompassing, closing in upon, absorbing every other fact conceivable. How can we investigate any part of any order of knowledge and stop short of that which enters into every order? All true principles run over with it. All phenomena converge to it. It is truly the first and the last." End quote. If you can see that we have some knowledge of God, it is difficult to navigate any science, including medicine, without acknowledging what is outside of science. Whether or not Hitchcock and Newman interpret the signs of our times correctly, it is my repeated experience over the last year that contemporary culture sees religion as a private affair that is relative and has no essential role in patient care. Society wishes to protect non-essential persons from public exposure to disease, but such a mentality has only served to heighten my awareness that religion today is
I hear you're sick.
has thought to belong at home and not at the patient bedside. As both a physician and a religious, I've sometimes felt pressure to take sides with either science or religion. Needless to say, it's difficult to integrate personal identity of your vocation, Catholic, Christian, religious sister, and avocation, physician, are considered contradictory. I've also met patients and healthcare workers that experience distress when religion is felt to interfere with patient care. Thus, our discussion also has implications for patient care. And I have experienced situations when patients and physicians themselves feel conflicted because of that cultural understanding that science and religion, healing and religion cannot go hand in hand. So I'm just going to pause briefly because that was kind of a lot of information. Essentially, that was the cognitive and historical context of my experience. It kind of reflects what has developed over history, and that is kind of an understanding that religion and science cannot coexist because one is an absolute truth and one is a relative truth. If there's any questions, I'll just check the box here real quick. Oops. I don't see where the chat box went. Is there anything in the chat box? Can anyone see that? Oh, chat, there is one there. Hold on.
I can see it.
What does it say? I'm sorry, I can't see it right now.
Somebody left and they said, I'm sorry, they can't stay on right now.
Okay, all right, excellent. All right, so let's move on. So before proceeding further, I paused briefly to establish a common vocabulary. What is religion? What is healing? If I polled the group, it is unlikely that everyone would give the same answers. But to have any meaningful discussion or dialogue, each participant must define terms, even if there is a divergence among or disagreement among participants about the correct definition of those terms. You see that kind of especially in the documents of the Second Vatican Council. You have to understand what each other are saying in order to understand where your ideas differ. I fully disclose that the definitions that I'm giving are my understanding of the Catholic tradition, and also my understanding of modern medicine. My translation of terms relies heavily on the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas understands God as a superior being that, one, sustains the universe, and two, serves as the principal and ultimate good that all persons seek, either knowingly or unknowingly. In Aristotelian terms, we might think of God as the unmoved mover. Religion is the virtue or habit of giving God God's due. However, the term virtue is easily misunderstood in our culture, so let's take one more step back further and define virtue. So virtue denotes a certain perfection of a human power in reference to act, or put more simply, a disposition or good habit that produces good works. Some examples of this: a soldier experiences battle and becomes courageous. That is, he or she learns from a current experience and exposure to act courageously and to be courageous by habit. In the soldier is the virtue of courage. His or her power of acting is perfected by the habit of courage. He or she can activate his or her potential for courage and act courageously when needed in combat. Another example: the virtue of justice is the disposition or habit of giving to each the right, or what is due. A judge moderates multiple court cases and becomes just. That is, he or she gains the experience to act justly. Religion is a virtue related to justice, analogous to a person being just by giving to another the right or what is due. So a person is religious by giving to God God's due. St. Thomas Aquinas defines religion as the disposition of a person to give to God what that person should give, so far as limited humanity can give. Just as a courageous person can be defined as a person disposed to courage, so a religious person can be defined as a person disposed to religion. That is, a courageous person rightly orders his or her acts in the face of danger, whereas a religious person rightly orders his or her acts in the face of God. For the purpose of better understanding the final part of my presentation, it's helpful at this juncture to observe that piety, like religion, also belongs to the pedigree of justice. St. Thomas Aquinas defines piety as giving to parents or country, namely those that beget and nurture us, what is due to parents or country respectively. It is intuitive to give a parent his or her due, and a country its due. Thus, it is also rational to give God God's due. This is just an art history aside, but this is from the Sistine Chapel here, and you know, Michelangelo actually integrated anatomy heavily into his art. So if you notice, God is actually in a brain because he is the logos, and so this is what the brain looks like for those of you who might not have seen the actual anatomy of it. So you can see the cerebellum, you can see the frontal lobe. And so he purposely made this cloak that's surrounding God to look like a brain.
Oh, wow.
So because we often think about religion and spirituality as interchangeable, let's also pause briefly to distinguish a spiritual person from a religious person. Spirituality concerns the means that an inferior subject uses to experience a superior object. In contrast, religiosity concerns the end, the relationship between the inferior subject and the superior object. A spiritual person has the disposition to experience something higher than him or herself. On the other hand, a religious person has the disposition to relate to something higher than him or herself. A spiritual person is disposed to study the divine, whereas a religious person is disposed to worship or serve the divine. As kind of a practical example, a demon is spiritual, but not religious. A guardian angel is spiritual and religious. The reason I bring this distinction up is a lot of times people don't understand how spirituality and religion differ, and that there could be really a deep meaning to religion that's even deeper than spirituality. The concept of liturgy or worship is also often used interchangeably with religion. However, because the virtue of religion involves a person's relationship with God, ritual worship is actually too narrow an idea to encompass the idea of religion. There are both interior and exterior activities of religion. St. Thomas lists devotion, prayer, adoration, sacrifice, oblation, tithe, profession of vows, oath, obedience, piety, and gratitude among the acts of religion. Many of these acts of religion of giving God God's due are done outside of a liturgy and can be done in quarantine or in a patient's room. Now, how do we define healing? So, although it seems moribund, I think the best way to address this question is actually to discuss death, because the potential for healing ends at the moment of death. There are two generally accepted definitions of death used by medical science: cardiopulmonary and neurological death. Cardiopulmonary death involves the irreversible cessation of spontaneous blood circulation and respiration. When a patient's heart has stopped, or it is an arrhythmia that does not result in blood circulation, which is called cardiac arrest, advanced cardiac life support, what we also call ACLS, can be performed to attempt to achieve return of spontaneous circulation, which is also known as ROSC. If unable to achieve that life-sustaining circulation, either because the patient fails to respond to ACLS or the patient is not a candidate for ACLS, then cardiopulmonary death is pronounced. On the other hand, neurological death or brain death involves the irreversible cessation of all brain function and is usually reserved to defining patients who are intubated, or on ventilators, or on something called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, called ECMO. And it's quite difficult to absolutely define brain death, on a ventilated person by observation alone. So we often use different special imaging techniques. For example, special imaging studies of the glucose metabolism of the brain, shown here. And there's also special protocols such as the apnea test that we can use to determine death with what we call, quote, moral certitude. However, a working definition of healing needs to be more inclusive than prolonging life or forestalling death. Otherwise, it would be incorrect to say that psychiatrists and physical, occupational, or speech therapists heal. What do cardiopulmonary death and brain death share? It is an oversimplification, of course, to say, but they both lack unitive integrity. That is, the potential for healing is gone at death because the parts of the organism are no longer functioning in an integrated way. And that which animates an organism and distinguishes it from a group of organs is absent. So another analogy I like to give to help to explain the concept of unitive integrity is our solar system. The solar system has unitive integrity. The planets are united in one common focus. That is, the solar system is characterized by unity. Further, the planets orbit in an integrated way, that is, with right relationship to the other planets. Thus, the solar system is also characterized by integrity. If understood as that which preserves or restores the unitive integrity of the person, healing can be mediated by many activities. Surgery can heal by removing a diseased organ to preserve the functioning of the organism at the expense of its parts. Pharmacology can heal by promoting a wholesome chemical environment for metabolism. Performing ACLS protocols can heal by restoring function of the heart for systemic blood circulation and oxygen delivery to tissues. I observed that my examples of healing through medical science tend to target various parts of the system or the interactions between parts. That is, healing with medical sciences restores or preserves the life of the organism by preserving or restoring integrity. Contrast this with supernatural healing, such as raising from the dead, which sometimes heals by restoring the very unitive integrity principle itself. St. Thomas Aquinas says of the word religion that it may be derived from the Latin infinitive, regulare, or to bind together. Wherefore Augustine says, may religion bind us to the one almighty God. So another cultural side, I'm not the only one who's thought about being bound to God as cosmic. In his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy, Dante artistically describes heaven as a planetary system with 9 spheres and God as the orbital focus. How does religion heal? Maybe we could say that it more closely binds a person to their ultimate end and good, which is done by exercising the virtue of religion, which strengthens the unitive integrity of a person. But trying to further explain how religion heals is analogous to trying to explain how a mother's close presence nurtures a newborn. At the birth of a child, we healers do our very best to keep the mother with the child because the interaction seems to make the child's introduction to the outside world smoother. Thus, for any further explanation of the healing power of religion, I'm going to stand with Job and say, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer thee? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once and I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further. Essentially, it's a mystery, kind of why uniting ourselves to God is healing, but intuitively we sense it similarly as we see the intuitive, as we see a baby does better when it's in the presence of its mother. So I'm going to briefly, stop and see if there's any. It doesn't look like there's any chat, so I can just go ahead and move forward unless anyone else has any questions. So now that we have a common vocabulary, I'm going to share a little bit about my own personal experience. It's easier for me to translate how I experience religion and healing at the level of individual societies if we have a common vocabulary. I'll start with the story of the patient I didn't heal. So Mrs. M was my patient on hospital wards around April of 2020. She would look up from her bed and see me like this. She was hospitalized not specifically because she had COVID, but although she was COVID positive, but because she needed an organ transplant. Unfortunately, after a prolonged hospital stay assessing her candidacy to get a transplant, she became too sick and the medical team could not offer her an organ transplant. She would die. She was too encephalopathic to understand this decision, and thus it was my responsibility to help communicate this decision to the family. Breaking the bad news to family that their loved one is not getting an organ transplant is hard, but the task before me seemed impossible. I was to communicate during a Zoom call with 3 daughters who hadn't seen their mother in weeks, that their mother was now going to die without seeing them. Their mother, my patient, was COVID-19 positive, and thus, 1, unable to have visitors, and 2, could not be discharged to an inpatient hospice facility. Nevertheless, my task of communication was done. Subsequently, the daughter shared with me that the patient's husband, their father, was concurrently intubated at a different hospital with COVID-19 pneumonia. They had contracted the illness together, and he was not expected to live. At the end of the virtual family meeting, I asked the daughters what their mother was like before she became confused. Was there anything I could do for her to help her prepare for death? The eldest daughter, who was the spokeswoman of the group, told me that Mrs. M was Catholic Christian. Could she receive the last rites, which we also call the sacrament of the sick? My heart leaped for joy because there was some type of healing that I could extend to my patient and her family. So after signing off of the Zoom call, I called the hospital chaplain and I explained the situation. The voice on the other side of the phone said, "Chaplains don't visit patients with COVID-19. I was crushed and I hung up the phone. I rotated off that floor and never saw the patient or talked to the family again. I would look for the patient's name on the hospital census occasionally after that while I was caring for other patients. I would say a prayer for Mrs. M and her family, and eventually I saw that Mrs. M had died. This experience probably demonstrates what is going on all over the country and the world. Even before the pandemic, chaplains were underutilized as a resource to facilitate healing. Consider this 2018 text from the American Medical Association Journal of Ethics, quote, "Today, clinical chaplaincy remains an underutilized resource in healthcare, as patient spirituality continues to be an area that clinicians do not discuss as often as they should. This finding is disappointing given the potential benefits of integrating patient religion and spirituality into clinical practice by improving empathy, building trust, and understanding behaviors. Acknowledging the moral underpinnings, spiritual or religious, that drive certain care-seeking behaviors from end-of-life care to contraception is critical in achieving a more holistic medical practice. Moreover, awareness of our patients' spiritual or religious beliefs helps us to be more aware of our own motivations, as spirituality and religion are important components that shape behaviors of many clinicians," end quote. The way I've kind of interpreted this in my recent experience is fearing personal disintegration through infectious disease. We have excluded chaplains and other religious healers from participating in the healing process. The pieces of the system individual persons may strengthen their personal unit of integrity by exercising religion. And so then neglect of religion threatens both the health of the patient and the very integrity of the healthcare infrastructure itself. In other words, the physicians themselves need to be able to practice religion, to reunite themselves to God, their creator. Despite my failure to fully care for Mrs. M, I was encouraged, however, by several individuals, including my local and general religious superior, my residency program director, and the Division of Chief of Palliative Care, to find a way to better care for my patients. I argued, if we're applying untested and potentially dangerous drugs and protocols on patients with COVID-19 to attempt healing, could we not facilitate healing by applying religion, which has thousands of years of experience and minimal risk? Religion, if desired, was due to my patients. Context. Many of you probably know what the sacrament of the sick bit is, but just to explain a little bit further, what Mrs. M's family was asking for on her behalf was the sacrament of the sick, which is also called extreme unction. This rite requires, one, the presence and prayers of a priest in the patient's room, and two, the application of consecrated oils to the body of the patient. St. Thomas described the effect of the sacrament of anointing as such, quote, "The sacrament produces their effect by signifying it. Extreme unction signifies and causes a spiritual healing through the bodily healing which it affects externally. However, a bodily healing does not always ensue from the sacrament, but only when it is requisite for the spiritual healing," end quote. The healing that a patient receives with the sacrament of the sick is not always bodily or visible, but it does religio, that is, rebind the patient to their ultimate end and good, God, so as to provide an opportunity for restoring spiritual unitive integrity and true healing. Because the end of the sacrament of the sick is an inner healing, and physical healing only happens if needed to bring about the spiritual healing, sometimes we don't see that healing visibly. And only spiritual persons have the eyes to see the effect of the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. So sometimes it's hard to explain that to people, especially my patients. They want automatic physical healing, but I have to explain this isn't a sacrament where we necessarily demand that physical healing. Rather, we're working on a spiritual healing. In some hospitals, the sacrament of the sick is safely done by trained priests who perform the rite according to a standard protocol by wearing personal protective equipment. So this right here is a protocol that the hospital that I currently work, well, I work at a clinic, but it's in association with the Catholic hospital. And this is the protocol that we use for the patients receiving the sacrament of the sick, that allows the priest to actually physically be present in the room, but at the same time be safe himself, and also to actually administer the physical property, the physical oils to the patient as well. So when I was a medical resident, I gathered information about the different protocols in the Catholic hospitals, and so with the advocacy of many persons, a priest at the institution where I was a resident was trained to darn personal protective equipment and anoint Catholic patients with COVID-19 according to a safe and ritually licit protocol. There are diverse opportunities to exercise religion with persons of other creeds, particularly Catholics. Many patients and their families express gratitude when care providers address spiritual needs because they intuitively sense that care is oriented to strengthening unitive integrity. I've seen many means to apply religious healing that are not sacraments and that do not involve physical contact with patients. So for example, this is one of my fellow residents working with the priest. This is an iPad, and we used it as an instrument for the patient and the chaplain to interact. And so the priest chaplain is about to go into the room to perform the sacrament of the sick because this COVID patient was dying, and that way the family can participate by watching, being present that way. It's worthy to note that a tree is known by its fruits. On occasions like this, when religion is exercised, unity of integrity is strengthened even among the healthcare team. So my fellow medical resident and the priest, working together to meet the needs of this patient religiously and spiritually really brought the whole team together. So on this occasion, an ASU and an ASAPU worked together for the good of the patient. So with that, pause briefly, see if there's any questions. Don't see any chat. Okay. So lastly, I'm just going to share briefly, just kind of, now that we've talked about kind of the cognitive and the historical context of understanding understanding religion and how it heals, and kind of the theological underpinning of that, and then my personal experience at like the personal level, it's worthwhile to think about how it's kind of affected our society, because the pandemic is global. It's affecting not just people, but societies. So, as pandemic disrupts worship, there's been racial riots and political vitriol that have shaken civil society. Social distancing is well named. Fear alienates people from God and from one another. Pandemic has been a force not only of physical illness, but also of social illness. In fear of physical disintegration through COVID-19, while attending to physical bodies, we have neglected fragmented communities without a metaphysical center or orientation. We try to restore and preserve the integrity of society with politics and law, but society collapses if a medical-physical respect for persons grounded in belief in a divine creator and theology is not sustained. So just to give kind of another example, when planets lose their relationship with the sun, it is inevitable that the interactions between planets also suffer. So without an organizing orbital focus, the planets are bound to collide. So remember, religion is the big brother of piety under the pedigree of justice. If not practicing justice toward God, which we call the virtue of religion, it makes sense that we would not also practice justice toward a nation, which we would consider the virtue of piety. So on January 6th of 2021, I graduated from residency and I was now here in Oklahoma practicing. On January 6th, which is the Catholic feast of the Epiphany, my patients and I watched the storming of the American Capitol on the news. The event was a crime against piety. That is, what was due to our nation, respect, was abused. And what can heal such an injustice and foster forgiveness to re-engage dialogue? The readings from the Catholic Mass for that day provide one possible channel. Quote, "See, darkness covers the earth, and thick clouds cover the peoples. But upon you the Lord shines, and over you appears glory. Nations shall walk by your light." End quote. This text from Isaiah suggests that God can be a force of unitive integrity in a national crisis. Our founding fathers had some insight into this. The writing on the wall in the Capitol is "In God we trust." You can actually see that in the back of this picture. While I don't pretend that the effects of our prayers and religious practices will be known in this life, the mere exercise of rebinding ourselves to the greatest good would orient the entire country to a common hope and end. Healing either of a person or of a society clearly involves more than science. It involves justice. It involves finding what is due and restoring or preserving the physical and metaphysical integrity of persons who are the units of society. Rebinding persons to the principle of their unitive integrity through religion promotes healing. It has been my experience that we are medically limited in our ability to heal patients with the most severe coronavirus infections, what we menacingly call COVID. But we have underutilized religion as a means of advancing inner healing and bringing meaning to suffering caused by illness and social alienation. In his book, Spirit of the Liturgy, Joseph Ratzinger, now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, describes unity as a common end of worship and of the universe. Quote. It's a long quote, so bear with me. We can now say that the goal of worship and the goal of creation as a whole are one and the same. Divinization, a world of freedom and love. But this means that the historical makes its appearance in the cosmic. Against the background of the modern evolutionary worldview, Teilhard de Chardin depicted the cosmos as a process of ascent, a series of unions. Spirit and its understanding embrace the whole and are blended into a kind of living organism. Teilhard went on to give a new meaning to Christian worship. The transubstantiated host is the anticipation and of the transformation and divinization of matter and that Christological fullness. In his view, the Eucharist provides the movement of the cosmos with its direction. It anticipates its goal and at the same time urges it on, end quote. So, in other words, for Catholics, the consecrated host of the Eucharist is a reality that anticipates cosmic unitive integrity and urges it on. And so, for example, by act of adoration, as an act of religio, rebinds us to God. And so it rebinds us to the person who is a channel for healing. So just kind of to give an example of how, how practicing religion might be a channel for introducing healing to societies. This is a picture from I have there are Religious Sisters of Mercy in Scotland, and in Edinburgh, Scotland, where my sisters are there, churches are closed. So recognizing that their local faith community in Edinburgh had unmet religious needs during the pandemic, they took action. And so what they did is now every Sunday afternoon, the public can safely participate in Eucharistic adoration from the sisters' convent window. So by exercising religion, it's kind of it's an opportunity for the whole public to kind of have a community way to really have exercise religion and thus have a source of healing for the whole community. So as the pandemic continues, I challenge you all to address the religious needs in your communities creatively and compassionately. So if you invite the divine to the patient's bedside, into your homes and in the public sphere, you might be surprised by the healing that you see. These are just some take-home points, kind of, if, a lot of what I said was kind of esoteric, et cetera, but if you can these are kind of the main points of the presentation. So, all right, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, sister. I know sometimes people need a chance to type out their thoughts, so we'll go ahead and give everyone a second in case you have any questions. Sister, can you see the chat on your end?
Yeah, now that I got out of the presentation, I actually can. I figured that's probably what was going on. I'm like, yeah, okay, now I can see it. Okay. Let me stop sharing my screen now. Probably don't need that anymore, huh? Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay. So kind of one of the comments was actually privately done. It's not given to me. It was privately done, but I think it's worth talking about. It says, this is a non-religious orientation, pan-medical, so common and wrong these days in the media. I'm appalled to observe a sister of God spouting neurology. It's sheer scratch. Forgive me, sister. I cannot remain a listener. This is not my faith nor credo. So unfortunately, I think kind of that response is one of part of the, we have there's two heresies in I don't want to suggest that what that comment is heretical, but there are two tendencies that we have. One of them is called fideism, and the other one is materialism. And so one of it is that you can't, and that's what Thomas Aquinas came up against, was that people did not believe that you could integrate science or rationality into the faith. But the point is, there's one truth. Both the scientific, essentially the idea is there's one truth, and how there's the science and religion, are ways to get at least to part of the truth. The faith is needed to get the full understanding of God. We need revelation. We need that. But science can go so far as since both are absolute truths, there is one God and we believe in him, then you're never going to see a contradiction between science and religion, a real true religion that's true. One of the books that I encourage anyone who has the same kind of opinion is the Dumb Ox, about St. Thomas Aquinas. It's really kind of beautiful. Chesterton talks about, he's the bellowing ox that filled the world, and his kind of experience of, St. Albert the Great was his mentor, and he was a great, scientist in his own right. But just, and in that book, Chesterton really does a good job explaining how there's the kind of the danger of the tendency of fearing things like philosophy or science, and fearing that was somehow competing with the truth of religion. So anyway, so that was a private comment to me. Another comment was that she agrees and drilled into the importance of caring for persons historically to include addressing their spiritual faith-based needs. I witnessed the power of this on many occasions throughout my career, important for both patients and family, as you've illustrated by use of an iPad to include the family during anointing them sick of their loved one. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because the reason I bring that example in there is because, I had to think about it. I'm like, what is necessary for the sacrament of anointing the sick? You need the priest's presence in the room. You cannot virtually anoint the sick. That's the beauty of being an incarnational faith. We believe in the body, so the priest had to be in the room. We couldn't have done that virtually. The only piece that was just allowed the family to participate, kind of in a spiritual communion, so to speak. Like we talk about people who cannot receive communion, we do a spiritual communion, which obviously isn't the fullness, but there's, and so it was kind of, so it's kind of hard. I had to explain to the hospital administration that you had to go to, you have to let the priest in the room. He can't do it outside the room from an iPad. He has to be in the room because it is, there's form and matter to the sacrament. So the priest had to be in the room and actually apply the sacred oils to the patient. You can do it with a Q-tip, but he has to be in the room and do it. So. What is the hardest part of being a doctor and a sister? I think part of it is, I think honestly, it's kind of honestly what that comment was that was given to me privately. It's just kind of the feeling that that I feel like I have to choose sides, which you don't. You don't have to choose sides between science and religion. You don't, you can understand neurology and talk about neurology and see it as a beautiful gift from God. take, for example, that brain that Michelangelo put on his, in his painting. It's just understanding the natural world. You can, what's that quote? There's a wonderful quote from Chesterton. I can give it to you to put in the follow-up email. But essentially, if you don't like misunderstanding the created world, you'll misunderstand the creator. Essentially, so. So I think that's probably the hardest part is, sometimes, feeling like an outsider in both the Catholic world and the medical world, because I'm people don't think they can go together. Yes, so the deacon is also able to administer the sacrament of the sick. Yes, so any minister, any consecrated minister, consecrated, have the sacrament of orders. All right. Is there any other questions? And just to let you know a little bit, the last part I ended with just our sisters. I am a religious sister of mercy. So I hope, essentially, if you want to know more about us, I'll send the link to our host here. But in case you want to know more about our community, we do run healthcare clinics. Our main clinic right now is in Alma, Michigan. Although we do also run mobile clinics, and I am working in an outreach clinic here in Muskogee, Oklahoma, where we are able to provide free care and also care to inefficiently insured patients. So it's kind of a real blessing that I've been given that opportunity by a Catholic infrastructure. Let's see, 2 more messages. So there's a question here to me. Have you ever encountered situations when the chaplain of a hospital is not Catholic or a Catholic priest is not available? The answer is yes. And that's part of the problem in being even in a Catholic hospital, there's just not an understanding of sacramentality. And so, part of it is people feel excluded. If you say, you're not Catholic, I really need a Catholic priest to do this particular thing. So the answer is yes. I've definitely experienced that. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's important for us to talk about these things and kind of understand sacramentality, to be able to explain it to people. Because the whole idea is we do believe there's a truth, there's an absolute truth. And so and according to our faith, certain people have been ordained to be able to administer that sacrament. And so to be able to explain sacraments and that it's not exclusionary, is important. It's more just kind of essentially our basic understanding of reality. So, and it's not a question of the worth of one religion over the other. It's just that's our understanding of what the religion is. It's kind of interesting. I had when I gave this presentation before, one of the things my community teased me about is there was someone that was, talking to me, and it was clearly not Catholic, and we were discussing, and my comment was like, we're just afraid to say to each other, you're wrong. The fact is, if you believe that religious truth is absolute, then it comes down to it that some aspects of some people's faith is wrong. And so it's hard for people to understand that it's not something so long answer to your question, yes. I have experienced people who are not Catholic, who are chaplains, and don't understand why you would need a Catholic and why it couldn't just be any chaplain. Okay, other questions, part of the beauty of including the patient's family. Yes, So exactly, that's kind of one of the things I tried to bring up in terms of talking about religion as healing for a whole communities of people. You know, not all religion, and that's where I kind of brought up about not all religion is sacrament, and not all religion is liturgy per se. And so, so that's a kind of religious healing that is not, that's kind of outside of the liturgical, in the setting that the family wasn't technically part of the liturgy since they weren't there physically, but there was a healing that could occur. Because God, part of it is people want to make it so narrow that people want to make God just can only work in the sacraments or can only work this way or that way. I mean, that's not the way it works. So religious healing can occur just spiritually too. Okay, are priests allowed to administer the Eucharist to patients on the tongue during COVID? Not at my particular institution. I'm not sure if if other people have different experiences. I mean, okay, so I guess we have made exceptions. To answer that question is yes, we have made exceptions to that. If the person can't, you know, bring the food to their mouth, but they can swallow. I mean, the patient has to be able to swallow to receive the sacrament. But yeah, so the answer is yes, I guess. But most of the time you really, because the other thing is we want to, you know, St. Paul talks about how you should be submissive to authority. And so the authority of the hospital and of society, you know, it really wants us to maintain social distance, et cetera. And so it's important to try to respect that as much as we can. But yes, so I guess we have had some patients receive the sacrament on the tongue, especially if they really can't physically, you know, hold it. Okay, here we go. Sister, I think we are confusing viaticum with sacrament of the sick. Deacons cannot administer the sacrament of anointing. Only a priest or a bishop can administer the sacraments of reconciliation, anointing of the sick. But a lay person may give a dying person Holy Communion as viaticum, the sacrament of the Christian. Thank you for that clarity, Deacon. Yes, exactly. So only a priest can actually do the anointing. We have sisters here in this hospital who help bring, you know, communion to patients, and that can be done by a lay person specifically. If that makes sense. But yes, as far as I understood, only a priest can actually do the anointing. So, and Deacon Marty, that's my understanding as well. Okay, is there any other comments, concerns, questions?
Unless anyone has any other questions for Sister, I don't see any that came in on my end either. Well, thank you so much, Sister. This was really, really wonderful, and I so appreciate your time. Very, you know, pertinent, very, very relevant to the times.
Yeah.
And very.
Yeah. All right. Well, God bless. You know, if anyone has questions, feel free to email, and I'm happy to answer offline, so to speak, too. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I'll be sending out a follow-up email to everyone, as you mentioned. So yeah, so thank you so much, Sister, and have a great rest of your evening to everyone else on the call.
Yeah. God bless.
Bye-bye.